Sure, now 11 years back, Jim O'Neill prepared the BRICS report, saying that, actually it was BRIC at that time. He talked about these 4 countries being the next economic miracles. Investors lapped up the story, they came into these markets, and to be fair to Jim O'Neill, many of them made money off these markets. Today, Ruchir Sharma says that these are the breakout nations. You've got a longer list, and you believe that these are going to be the stories over the next foreseeable future. What's to say that these economies will actually deliver?
I have no idea, which is that this is my best guess, that we all work in terms of probabilities. But as I tell you, that it's that last decade, it's not BRIC only which did well, it's every single emerging market did well, but BRIC got the maximum attention simply because they were the largest economies. So I think that is the important distinctive point. I'm not here trying to package nations and sell them. My entire point of the book is that the last decade was freaky, that you've never had a period in development history where every single emerging market has done well. Right? Because there are about 180 countries today tracked by the IMF. Only 35 are developed countries. All the other countries are still emerging or have been emerging for 100, 200 years. Right? So they go through these cycles, Brazil-type situations where they do well for 1 decade, and then for the next decade or 2, they don't do that well. So my point here is not to sort of smash some brick or to offer a new package of countries. The point here is about differentiation, that as growth rates slow down across the world, and as the tide of global liquidity ebbs, which it has been doing, in this sort of environment there will be much more differentiation, and the differentiation needs to be done on a country-by-country basis. Whereas last decade was all about aggregation. Like some of these big countries, like China, etc., really underperformed the other emerging markets in terms of stock market returns. So it's not, and some like countries such as even a Czech or in Egypt, produced much better returns than some of these BRIC countries. So the whole idea was that BRIC came into being simply because every single emerging market did very well. And I'm not trying to say here that the BRIC is smashed, but today when I look at countries on an individual basis, I find that the likes of Russia, Brazil do not make the cut for countries which will surprise on the upside. And on India, it's a more nuanced view, as I said. It's more 50-50, and I find other countries which do that. But I know that it's very popular for us to pit one against the other. So we talk about BRIC versus BRIC out. That's not really my idea. I'm trying my best here to say this is going to be about differentiation, that this business of aggregating nations together is not going to work.
Right now, Ruchir, do you worry that many of these countries that you've listed out, the breakout nations, could also become victims of their own hype, just as you talked about India having become a victim of its own hype? And should we expect that from 10 years from today, we could have another report that says that Afghanistan maybe is the next China?
I've said this very clearly, that my job here is not to write a report. It was to write a book, an economic travelogue, where we go around the world and try and see what's going on in different countries. This is not just about forecasting. And I've kept my forecasting horizons to what I think are reasonable lengths. Like the one thing which does bug me is when people talk to me about what's going, how the world will be in 2030 or 2040. And my entire take on that is that who cares?
Or we'll all be dead.
Exactly. Or who will be around to hold us accountable for those fancy forecasts? I've tried to go across the path that what do I see for the next 3-5 years? And I've even listed out what the factors are which could derail some of the countries I call breakout nations, like Indonesia. It still is a bit dependent on commodity demand. Its political leadership is dependent on SBY. But, if the rumors about him trying to bring his wife into politics or doing some of that stuff sort of really transpires in that manner, Indonesia will fall off the map as well. So I think that the whole idea here is that this is about impermanence. It's a game of snakes and ladders. That's what really that we are playing here, which is that some countries make it up for a while, get bit by a snake, and they fall back down and have to start all over again.
And you said that there's more snakes than ladders.
There are more snakes than ladders because a stunning statistic is that of the 180 countries in the world today, only 35 are developed countries. And everyone's been trying. Everyone wants to be a developed country. And there are enough countries which have been trying for years and decades to become a developed country and have failed.
You made the point that if local prices in the country are far too expensive, even to someone from a rich nation, then the likelihood is that that country will never become a breakout nation. Now, that's one way of looking at it. There's another way of looking at it, that supply of that service or supply of that product is just too little in that country, and there is a huge catch-up that country needs to do. So maybe then it is still a breakout nation.
It could be. I mean, like every rule has its exceptions, and any generalization will always, be open to being taken apart on the basis of some exceptions. But as I show in that Four Seasons Index, that the countries today with the most expensive currencies are the likes of Brazil, Russia, which are commodity exporters. And if you look deep down in those countries, outside of the commodity sector, there's not that much which is going on in terms of their exports. And there's not that much which is going on the ground. In the case of Brazil, if you look at it, Brazil today is running a current account deficit, even in the midst of a commodity boom, because the exchange rate is so expensive that everyone finds it much better to just import rather than to produce at home. And the government is very, very worried about that. And if you look at some of the cheap currencies which show up on that index, those are countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, Poland, and they all have competitive exchange rates. And if you look at one common factor behind the East Asian economic miracles from Korea, Taiwan, Japan earlier, and even China, they all had competitive exchange rates. They all had cheap exchange rates. So my limited point here is that you'd rather invest in countries where the exchange rate is in your favor than against you. Because let's not forget that over the past decade, the currency added a lot to total returns in some of these countries. And we are all international investors, so total returns is what matters to us a lot.
Now, you've also made the point that if a country is generating too many billionaires,
right,
then the country is likely, relative to the size of its economy, then it's likely that the country is off balance. So you've talked about India having 55 billionaires.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Turkey is in your breakout nation. Yeah. Turkey has 38 billionaires. Now, on a relative basis, in terms of size of economy between the two countries, Turkey effectively has more billionaires than India.
Yeah.
So is that a fair point to make? Because, you can argue that many of these billionaires in India are, the beneficiaries of crony capitalism. But that isn't necessarily the case.
I think your point is very valid out here. As I mentioned, there are a whole sort of rules of the road I come up with, and it's not one thing which trips a nation, it's a combination of factors. But so if you look at deeper between the Turkey and the India example as to why I'm more worried about it in India than I'm about it in Turkey, that the billionaires index, I've looked at it in a much more three-dimensional manner. One way to look at it is the share of the total economy that the billionaires have. The second, very important metric is the churn factor. And the third one that I talk about is also from which industries are they emerging. And in Turkey, at least, I find that the churn factor is much better, and the new billionaires surfacing on that index are coming from new regions. And in India's case, I think wealth needs to be celebrated. And the billionaires, some of them who I know quite well, I have a lot of respect for. My point about India is in the last 5 years, we've seen very little churn as far as the billionaires are concerned. That we've only basically seen in the top 10 billionaires, I think there's only one new name which has surfaced. And I think that to me, that is the more important bit. And the fact that the billionaires coming out of India in the last 5 years have been more from the real estate mining sectors, which involve some government help, rather than sectors such as technology and manufacturing, also gives me some cause for concern. So it's a much more three-dimensional index. That's one metric only as a share of the total wealth. And for every Turkey, which may sort of be a breakout nation and yet have a large number of billionaires, I can always point out to you like a Russia or a Malaysia, which also do and are known to be much more prone to cronyism than a Turkey is.
And Ruchir, lastly, you've talked about a reversal in Europe and the rediscovery of the West. Now, what gives you so much faith in OECD markets? Because a number of people we speak to believe that, the OECD region needs to prepare for a new normal where you're going to see patchy or flat growth going forward, and that the average European American needs to readjust his life to the new normal that he's going to be faced with.
Yeah.
Within all of that, you seem, hugely optimistic.
No, I think that, again, it's about expectations. And I don't talk that much about Europe, I talk about US. Because Europe has its problems. But I think that about the US, what I say is that in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008-2009, a lot of us, including me, thought that the US would follow the path of Japan, which is this long period of stagnation of 1% economic growth, which is what Japan's had for the last 20 years and possibly will continue to have. So I'm not optimistic on Japan at all, as I mentioned in the book. But I think that as far as the US is concerned, what we're seeing is a remarkable amount of resilience in the face of the problems that you just mentioned. Everybody knows today the US has a big problem to do with government debt. But in the face of that, how the private sector is doing, I think is quite remarkable. And therefore, this year, the economy seems to be on track to grow at 2.5%, which is lower than what it used to be. Like about 3.5% has been the average from 1950 till 2007. But in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we expected 1% growth, and we're getting now 2.5%. And that is a meaningful increase for a country like the US. As I mentioned in the book, that if the US grows at 2.5% over the next 5 years, and if China slows to 6 to 7%, the US will go back to being the largest contributor to global growth, a position it ceded to China in 2007. And what the US has going for it is a combination of factors. One is a very competitive exchange rate, and two, which is still underappreciated, is that 1/3 of total R&D spend in the world is done in the US. And that's why all the killer applications, the social networking, the iPhones, the cloud computing, all these things still tend to emerge out of the US. And the second thing also is the fact that because wage growth in the US has been so low, and in China it's been quite high, a new word is coming up now increasingly called reshoring, which is of jobs moving back in the manufacturing sector to the US. And the other sort of advantage is the oil boom the US is enjoying today. The US's dependency on foreign energy is going down systematically over time, both because of an oil boom in places from Kansas to North Dakota, to the fact that you're seeing the shale gas boom also take place. So all these factors, and part of this is because of technology, the fracking technology that they have in shale gas, all these factors are allowing the private sector to hold the US economy up and surpass expectations in the face of the problems, which have to be recognized, the debt problems, and it's quite possible that next year we'll get a big fiscal adjustment which will hurt growth. But the structural positives coming out from the US are still quite appealing to me.
Right, Ruchir Sharma, many thanks for coming in and talking to us about your book, and congratulations once again.
Thank you. Thank you.